Most medieval armies were basically assembled for the season, a mix of nobles, local levies, and hired fighters who didn't train together for long. The Knights Templar were the opposite. They were a permanent military order with strict rules, a clear chain of command, and a day-to-day routine built around readiness. That's why their enemies took them seriously, and their allies kept putting them in the hardest positions. This isn't about secret treasures or Hollywood legends. It's about practical battlefield advantages, discipline that held under pressure, training that focused on real conditions, and an organization that could keep men, horses, armor, and supplies working when other forces fell apart. Number 1. Built for constant war. Most medieval armies in Western Europe were not designed to stay together for long. A king or great lord would call up vassals for a limited period of service, add local levies, and hire a few specialists if there was money. The result could look impressive on the day everyone arrived, but it was often a patchwork. Different lords, different priorities, and men who had never trained as one body. Once the campaigning season ended, or the money ran thin, the host broke apart. That system can win battles, but it struggles to produce consistent performance, because consistency usually comes from routine and repetition. The Crusader States in the Eastern Mediterranean were exactly the kind of place where inconsistency gets punished. There were raids on roads, attacks on farms, ambushes in passes, and sieges that could drag on for months. You needed escorts today, garrisons tomorrow, and field forces on short notice. A part-time host raised for a summer is not enough. The Knights Templar were created to solve that problem. They were a permanent military order, meaning their identity was tied to staying organized and staying ready. They lived under a shared rule, took vows that locked them into the institution, and answered to a leadership structure that did not change every campaign. They could maintain garrisons year-round, run patrols, escort convoys, and then still assemble for major operations without first having to invent an army from scratch. Their independence mattered too. As a papal order, they were not supposed to be controlled by local nobles in the way a typical feudal force was. That gave them political complications later, but on campaign it made coordination easier. A commander could rely on them as a unit with its own discipline, its own supplies, and clear internal authority. Instead of bargaining with dozens of lords, you could work with a single organization that could field trained men and keep them in the field. So when people talk about the Templars being better at fighting, a big part of it is that they were built to fight repeatedly in a setting where most medieval forces were not designed for constant war. That difference shows up everywhere, in discipline, training, logistics, and the ability to keep learning from one campaign to the next. Number 2. Discipline as a weapon. Medieval knights were not untrained. Many were excellent riders and dangerous fighters. The problem was that medieval warfare also rewarded personal reputation. Knights competed for honor, for ransoms, and for the kind of daring that turned into stories. That culture produces courage, but it can also produce chaos, because the temptation is always there to chase a personal moment instead of holding formation. The Templars worked hard to cut that impulse down. Their rule was religious, but it was also practical. It regulated money, clothing, daily routines, and obedience. The goal was to make self-control normal. When you live for years in a system where your day is scheduled and your behavior is monitored, it becomes easier to keep your head when a battlefield is loud, hot, and confusing. This matters most in cavalry combat. A heavy cavalry charge is not just ride fast and hit. It is timing, spacing, and a shared commitment to stay aligned. If the front line surges too early, the rear is still accelerating and the formation stretches out. If individuals break ahead, gaps appear, and the impact turns into scattered duels. The Templars developed a reputation for charging in tight groups and only when ordered. Medieval sources describe them organizing into small tactical blocks, then responding to orders given through banners and horns. The order even had its own distinctive black and white war banner, and keeping that banner upright and visible was not just symbolism. It was a way to keep units oriented when dust and noise made everything else unclear. They enforced that obedience with internal penalties that mattered inside their culture. A temporary army can threaten punishment, but it often struggles to enforce it during a fight. The Templars could impose penances, strip status, and shame a man within the community he depended on. That social pressure is powerful when your identity and your daily life are tied to the order. Discipline also shows up in the unglamorous moments that decide outcomes. Not chasing a retreat too far, not looting too early, not abandoning a wall section because something looks more exciting somewhere else. It helped that the order treated wealth as communal property. A brother was not supposed to treat captured goods as personal prizes, which reduced the usual temptation to break ranks the second an enemy line wavered. The Templars were not perfect, but compared to many medieval forces, they were more likely to act as a coordinated unit instead of a collection of individual careers. So their discipline was not just a moral point. It was a battlefield advantage that made their movements more predictable to their own commanders and harder to disrupt for their enemies. Number 3. Training that fits reality. In medieval Europe, military skill often grew out of daily life for the warrior class. A noble boy learned to ride, handle weapons, and manage horses as part of growing up. He might practice in tournaments and small fights, and then learn the rest in real war. That produces talented individuals, but it does not automatically produce a unit that can maneuver together under pressure. The Templars pushed training towards something more collective and more routine. Their job was not occasional war. Their job was escort duty, patrols, garrison work, and sudden battles in a hostile environment. You cannot improvise your way through that for long. They trained horsemanship under stress. A horse is a living animal that reacts to noise, pain, and fear. In a tight formation, one panicked horse can knock riders together and open gaps. So the rider has to control the animal, keep alignment, and keep moving even when the situation feels overwhelming. This is one reason discipline mattered so much. It was not only mental discipline, it was physical discipline in how the unit moved. They trained the core weapons in practical ways. The lance was the main shock tool, used under the arm to deliver maximum impact. After the first collision, fights often turned into close contact, where swords, maces, and other impact weapons were more useful against armor. The point was not style. It was repeated practice until action became automatic under fatigue. They also trained for dismounted fighting. In the Holy Land, siege warfare was constant. Defending a gate, holding a breach, or fighting in broken terrain could force knights off their horses. A fully armored man on foot is slower, but he is also difficult to push back. If that armored man is part of a disciplined group that stays close and protects each other, he becomes even harder to break. Many knights could fight on foot if forced. The Templars treated it as part of normal service. Another advantage is that experience stayed inside the institution. A feudal host might fight one campaign and then dissolve, losing its lessons as soon as everyone went home. The Templars kept routines, offices, and veteran culture over decades. That creates institutional memory. Which routes are dangerous, which enemy tactics repeat, which mistakes keep getting men killed, and which defensive habits actually work. Over time, that kind of accumulated knowledge becomes a real edge. So the Templars were not just brave men with good horses. They were men who practiced together for the situations they actually faced, and they carried those lessons forward from one generation of brothers to the next. Number 4. Selection and cohesion. The order was not a random collection of warriors. It was selective by design, and selection changes battlefield performance. The Knight brothers were usually men of noble background, because heavy cavalry was tied to wealth and status. But the order was larger than its knights. It included sergeants, who were fighting men of lower rank with different equipment, and it relied on specialists and servants who kept the whole machine running: grooms, armorers, administrators, and chaplains. In the Eastern Mediterranean, Crusader warfare also made use of local auxiliaries, often called Turcopoles, who could scout, skirmish, and ride in ways that suited the region. The details varied from campaign to campaign, but the broader point is clear. Successful armies in that setting needed more than one style of fighter. A force made only of heavy knights is strong in one moment and helpless in another. What made the Templars effective is that they could integrate different roles under one system. Medieval armies often struggled with coordination because each lord treated his men as a private club, and different contingents did not want to obey anyone else. The Templars reduced that friction because their identity came from the order first. Everyone had a place in the hierarchy and a defined job. The order also filtered personalities. A man had to accept communal living, strict obedience, and limited personal freedom. Anyone who wanted constant personal display, private wealth, or independent decision-making was not a good fit. Over time, that creates a group more comfortable with structure and less likely to break discipline for ego. Cohesion is not just about obeying orders. It is about trust. In close combat, you need to believe the man beside you will hold his position. In a cavalry charge, you need to believe the line will stay aligned. In a retreat, you need to believe someone will protect the withdrawal instead of running for safety. The Templars built a culture where that trust was reinforced daily, not only in battle. And then there is reputation. Once an order becomes known for holding steady and fighting as a unit, allies place it in critical positions and enemies treat it with caution. That changes the behavior of everyone around it. Reputation is not mythology. It is a practical factor that shapes decisions before fighting even begins. Number 5. Readiness in steel and leather. A lot of medieval fighting comes down to a blunt reality. If your equipment fails, skill cannot save you. Armor needs constant care. Leather straps tear. Metal links break. Blades chip. Horses lose condition if they are not fed and handled properly. The difference between a unit that performs well and one that collapses can be as simple as whether it shows up with gear that works and mounts that can still move after a hard march. The Templars had an advantage because they were an institution with procedures and storage, not just individuals responsible for their own kit. They aimed for dependable equipment and enforced rules about how it was treated. Instead of every man doing whatever he wanted, there were expectations, inspections, and a shared understanding that neglecting gear was not just a personal problem. It endangered the brothers next to you. That attitude sounds simple, but it changes how people behave when they are tired and tempted to cut corners. In the 12th century, the typical heavy cavalry armor system was mostly mail. A long mail shirt, a mail hood, and heavy padding underneath. Helmets and shields protected the head and the approach. Over the 13th century, armor technology across Europe added more plate pieces to protect vulnerable joints and shins. The Templars did not invent these changes, but they had the resources and the organizational habits to keep up and to maintain what they had. Shields mattered even more in the Levant than many people assume. Missile fire was common, and a shield could be the difference between reaching the moment of contact intact or arriving already worn down. On foot, shields also support formation fighting. A disciplined group with shields can hold a line longer, which is exactly what you need when you are buying time or guarding a breach. Horses were part of the same system. The famous image of a single heroic warhorse hides the practical truth that cavalry depends on supply, spare animals, pack animals, feed, and replacement mounts. The Templars invested in horses through estates and through connections across regions. They also had grooms and support staff, because caring for horses is skilled work, not something you do on the side. This creates a culture of readiness. A unit that expects to fight next week keeps its equipment ready today. In a medieval context, where many forces assembled in a rush and then tried to fix problems on the march, routine readiness is an advantage you can feel on the battlefield. Number 6. Command that survives chaos. In many medieval armies, leadership existed, but the system of leadership was weak. A king might issue an order, but powerful nobles could ignore it. Allies might argue over status. Different contingents might coordinate poorly, because they did not practice together and did not trust each other. When a battle started, those weaknesses showed up fast. The Templars had a clearer chain of command. They had officers responsible for operations, discipline, and logistics, and those roles existed across the order, rather than being tied to a single family. The exact titles can sound technical, but the function is simple. Defined authority that does not depend on one personality. Because the order ran the same way in different places, it could break its men into familiar subunits and still function if a leader was wounded or killed. A field contingent was not just a crowd of knights, it was a set of groups with their own officers, and the men were expected to stay with their group and rally to the banner if they got separated. That sounds obvious, but in medieval battles, units often dissolved into clusters of individuals the moment contact began. The Templars tried to prevent that dissolution by treating formation as a rule, not a suggestion. That structure made communication more meaningful. Medieval battlefields were loud, dusty, and confusing. You cannot rely on shouted instructions once lines engage. So armies used banners, horns, and messengers. But those tools only work if everyone has been trained to respond the same way. The Templars were trained to treat signals as commands, and their internal discipline reinforced that with real consequences for ignoring orders. This is why they could be used as an anchor or a reserve. A reserve is only useful if it can be held back without drifting forward, and then committed decisively at the right moment. Many medieval commanders struggled to keep impatient knights from charging too soon. A disciplined order could actually wait, and when the line was under pressure, a unit known for holding its shape could stabilize the situation long enough for others to regroup. Crusader armies often placed military orders in critical roles like the vanguard or rearguard during marches. Those roles demand steadiness more than heroics. The rearguard in particular has to endure harassment without breaking formation, because if it collapses, the entire column can turn into a running crowd. A force that can perform those jobs consistently becomes the kind of tool commanders rely on when everything else feels uncertain. So their advantage here was not only bravery, it was command reliability, the ability to turn leadership into coordinated movement under the worst conditions medieval warfare could produce. Number 7. Tactics shaped by the enemy. The Templars fought opponents who were often fast, organized, and patient. Mounted archers and light cavalry could circle, shoot, retreat, and bait heavy troops into mistakes. The goal was to break discipline and pull enemies out of position. Against that style of warfare, raw courage is not enough. You need emotional control and unit control. This is where the Templars' discipline and training combined into real tactical strength. They became known for absorbing harassment without turning the battle into a scattered chase. That is active defense, holding alignment, protecting weaker troops, keeping shields up, and refusing to let anger or frustration dictate movement. When the moment was right, they could deliver shock. They also paid attention to where that shock could work. Heavy cavalry needs space to build speed, and a surface that will not break the formation. If the ground was too rough, too narrow, or too soft, they were more likely to hold back, stay close to supporting infantry, or wait near a defensible point like a hill or a fortified camp. A heavy cavalry charge works best when it hits as a dense block, with timing that catches the enemy at a weak point. The purpose is to create a sudden collapse, not to win one-on-one duels. The Templars were valued because they could deliver that controlled impact more reliably than many ad hoc knightly groups. They also learned to coordinate with other troop types. Crusader forces used infantry spearmen to hold ground, and crossbowmen to punish enemy cavalry and disrupt formations. Crossbows were especially useful because they could threaten armor more effectively than many bows at the ranges common in these fights. A disciplined cavalry unit that can time its movement with missile support is far more dangerous than cavalry acting alone. And they stayed flexible. If horses were the wrong tool, they fought on foot, in tight terrain, in broken ground, or during siege assaults and defenses, dismounted armored men could form a stubborn block. They were not fast, but they were hard to push back, and in medieval warfare, buying time can be the same as winning. So their tactics were not mysterious. They were a set of habits suited to the region. Resist baiting, keep cohesion, strike when conditions favor shock, and accept that fighting on foot is sometimes the smarter choice. Number 8. Fortresses and operational depth. Open battles are memorable, but the Crusades were also a long war of walls, roads, and supplies. Fortresses controlled passes, protected ports, guarded farmland, and created safe zones where armies could regroup. The Templars played a major role in this, because they held and managed key strongpoints and ran garrisons as a normal mission, not as a temporary assignment. A fortress is not only stone, it is water storage, food storage, workshops, stables, and a base for patrols and escorts. If you hold a chain of strongpoints, you can move troops with less risk, send messages more reliably, and respond faster to raids. The Templars used these bases to support the original purpose they were founded for, protecting travelers and maintaining security on critical routes. Castles like Safed in the Galilee, rebuilt and held by the Order for years, show what that meant in practice. A strong garrison could watch the surrounding countryside, send patrols, and delay enemy movements by forcing a siege. Other coastal fortifications associated with the Order, such as the massive stronghold at Atled, often called Chateau Pellerin, were built to secure key points and to provide a defensible base even when the wider situation turned against the Crusader States. Garrison life also shapes fighting quality. A unit that spends years on border duty develops habits that are directly useful in battle. Watch schedules, quick assembly, controlled response to alarms, and discipline at night. Those habits create steadiness. When a surprise attack hits, you do not have time to invent organization. You either have it already, or you do not. Fortresses also change strategy. They let you delay an enemy, force him to invest time and resources, and buy time for reinforcements. A feudal host often could not wait long, because service limits and politics pushed for quick decisions. The Templars could hold positions longer and keep operating even when a campaign dragged on. That endurance is a form of fighting skill, because it shapes what an enemy can and cannot do. This is why commanders valued them. Not every victory looks like a charge across open ground. Sometimes it looks like keeping a gate closed, keeping a road open, and staying in the war when other forces rotate home. Number 9. The network that made fighting possible. Templar effectiveness on the battlefield is hard to separate from their support network. Across Europe, they had estates and local houses that produced income and material. Grain, livestock, horses, metalwork, and cash. These places, often called commanderies, were not just properties. They were nodes in a system designed to support war far from home. They also handled money at a scale unusual for a military organization. Travelers could deposit valuables and receive written credit that could be redeemed elsewhere, and rulers borrowed funds from them. This is sometimes exaggerated into myths about secret treasure, but the basic reality is practical and important. A disciplined institution trusted to store and transfer wealth has real power in a medieval world. In military terms, access to money and credit means you can do things other forces struggle to do. You can pay for ships and transport. You can buy siege materials. You can hire skilled specialists like sailors and crossbowmen. You can replace horses after losses. You can keep garrisons supplied when harvests fail, or when local resources are scarce. All of that turns into battlefield strength because it keeps the unit functioning when others start cutting corners. The network also helped with communication. When you have houses and contacts spread across regions, you have reliable places to send messengers, confirm information, and coordinate movements. Medieval intelligence was never perfect, but a wide network increases speed and reduces uncertainty. It helps commanders react to news, move supplies, and shift forces before a crisis becomes a disaster. Logistics also affects morale and discipline directly. Hungry troops become reckless. Troops who do not trust their supply situation are more likely to scatter to forage or to panic in a tight moment. The Templars could not control every setback, but they were better positioned to recover because they had multiple sources of support instead of one fragile supply line. So when someone asks why they were so effective, it is fair to say it plainly. They were better at the behind-the-scenes work that makes fighting possible, and that foundation made their training and discipline count for more. And because their administration was written and centralized, it was easier to track supplies and spot problems early. Number 10. The proof and the boundaries. The Templars earned their reputation in real campaigns, and the record shows both what they did well and what no unit can do. They were often placed in hard roles because commanders trusted their steadiness. Escorting columns under harassment, holding key points, forming the disciplined core of an attack, or covering withdrawals when an army needed time to regroup. Their legend includes moments where disciplined heavy cavalry changed the feel of a battle. Montchaussade in 1177 is remembered because a smaller Crusader force, including a strong Templar contingent, struck with surprise and concentrated force against a much larger army. During the Third Crusade, actions like the march and battle near Arsuf in 1191 show the value of staying in formation under constant pressure and then launching a coordinated counterattack at the right moment. These examples are not about magic. They are about discipline, timing, and units that move as one. But the same history shows hard limits. At Hatton in 1187, Crusader forces were exhausted, short of water, and maneuvered into a position where the enemy controlled the conditions. Under those circumstances, even disciplined troops suffered catastrophic losses. Disasters like La Forbie in 1244 show another reality. A hard core can fight stubbornly and still be overwhelmed when numbers, coordination, and strategic choices go against it. Later, at Acre in 1291, military orders fought in the defense of the last major Crusader stronghold on the mainland, but the broader strategic situation had already turned against them. This is the cleanest way to understand what made the Templars better. They were more consistent than most medieval forces. They were built for cohesion, trained for the missions they actually faced, and supported by an organization that could keep them supplied and replaced over time. That made them unusually reliable in a world full of temporary hosts and fragile alliances. At the same time, their story shows that battlefield effectiveness does not protect an organization from politics. The Order's wealth, independence, and armed presence created fear among rulers who wanted control. In the early 14th century, the Templars were broken by accusations and political pressure, not by defeat in a field battle. Their methods of discipline, organization, and long-term support outlived the Order itself, because those methods were the real source of their fighting power.